Okay, yeah, microphone's on. So we're right at 11:30. Perfect. And just a quick introduction. Our speaker this morning is Mr. Jonathan Rich. He's the author of the award-winning new book, Spires in the Sun, which includes a chapter about our church. Jonathan is a retired corporate lawyer who's studied Florida human and natural history for decades. Third-generation Floridian, yay. Lives with his wife in Winter Park near Orlando. With Jonathan today is Phil. Phil could not be here. Okay, and Phil did the photography for Spires in the Sun. He's a commercial photographer and a ninth-generation Floridian. I'm only 7. So yeah, if you guys will, and by the way, Miss Catherine Bissett, who is the bookstore manager at the St. John's Cathedral, is in the back with the books and will be able to take payment with credit card or whatever method if you're interested in buying a book. So, yeah. With that, Jonathan, why don't you come on up and tell us all about it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's a great... I will use it. I tend to run around the church when I have the opportunity, and I'll probably do that, and I'll try to project my voice when I do. Listen, it's a great honor to be with you today and to offer a few thoughts about this style of architecture, and I'll try to place this church into the context of that style. But first, lest you should flog me out of the temple for money grubbing here, I want to point out that I don't make any money from the sale of this book. I never have, and almost certainly never will. I've assigned the authorial rights, and my collaborator Phil Eschbach has as well, to the Episcopal Church, with the result that all of the net proceeds of the sale of the book go to outreach missions of the church. So I thought we would get that out of the way. I'm going to start by reading you just the opening of the chapter on this church, and I have a particularly personal reason for doing that. I am, as you heard, a Florida native. I was raised in Central Florida. At some early age, I became aware of this architectural style, which is found at Good Shepherd in Maitland and Christ Church in Longwood. And then after that, I became aware of Emmanuel in Willaca, and then in my early 20s, became aware of All Saints in Enterprise. So let's fast forward to maybe 40 years ago. I came up to Jacksonville to Barnett Bank to give a talk to an assembled department of bankers there. And the head of the department said, look, I don't have an honorarium or a fee, but I will take you out to lunch. And then afterward, how about if we go up and see an international tennis event on Amelia Island? And I was a tennis enthusiast, which she knew. And I said, yes, I'd be delighted. So I came up, gave the talk, we had the lunch, and we're in her car on the way to Amelia Island on Heckscher Drive, and she says, have you ever been to Fort George Island? I said, well, yes, I have. I remember the Kingsley plantation is there. And she said, is that all you saw? And I said, well, I don't remember anything else. And she said, well, you would. And she said, how about if we stop there? I want to show you something. So we came up the drive here, and I saw this church for the first time. And the reason I say that is because everything has a beginning. Every project has some creative spark or some moment. Life begins with the subdivision of a cell, right? And at that moment, I saw this incredibly beautiful church and realized that, unique as it was, it had elements in common with the other churches that I had known. And something in me clicked, that just a realization that there was a story to be told here. I didn't get around to telling that story till many years later, but there was a realization at that point, without which I think it would be fair to say this would have never happened. Again, I didn't begin the work then, but something occurred to me. Florida has not exactly been neglected by writers and photographers. There are books about Florida's swamps, Florida's alligators, Florida's beaches, Florida's oranges. There are books about Addison Misner, Henry Flagler, Ponce de Leon. But to my astonishment, when I began digging, I realized that nobody had ever done a book about these churches. Yes, there was Cushman's history on the Diocese of Florida. There were Bentley's books about the Diocese of Florida, but nobody had ever done a book about these churches. Well, with that, I thought I would read you this passage, which to some extent recaptures my first visit. To get to Fort George Island, you take Heckscher Drive, which runs along the north shore of the St. Johns River above Jacksonville. After about 10 miles, you must turn north, taking a side road. The road soon narrows to a single lane of cracked asphalt, hemmed in on both sides by southern red cedars, boot-jacked sable palms, and sprays of palmettos. Through gaps in the vegetation, you start to catch glimpses of mud flats, tufted with saltwort, groundsel bushes, and black tree snags. The stark landscapes stretch away to palm hammocks, glittering ribbons of tidal water, and marsh grasses. At this point, you realize that the road is tracing a thin, sandy isthmus across a salt marsh. Momentarily on your left, you notice a collection of low, tabby ruins roped off by the Florida Park Service. Soon after, you come to a place where the road dips, and a sheet of the tea-colored water from the marsh flows across it. Your tires splash through, and from the open car windows, you notice the air has a saltwater tang. Now, on the right side of the road, the view opens onto vast ranks of cordgrass and needle rush, which at the moment are rippled by an onshore breeze. A minute later, you arrive at an opening in the woods on the left. Here, there is a black and white Florida historical marker. Behind it are several oaks, a crushed shell driveway, and a grass lawn rising to a slight mound. But what draws your eye at the center of the mound is a tiny white board and batten church with pointed green window frames and an arched red door. The building is skirted by several palm trees, impossibly tall and spindly, that rise beyond the metal roof and bellcote to splash their green spiky fronds against a blue sky. While you are absorbing this, a royal peacock wanders into view from behind the church. Oblivious to the incongruity of his presence, he turns an eye to the ground and pecks it, then fans and vibrates his train of iridescent eye spots. A moment later, a blue heron glides past to land on a low cedar branch. It ruffles its feathers and settles into a study of the marsh. Beyond its dagger bill, in the distance, a mullet leaps from the water, a speck flashing in the sun. Well, that's the opening of the chapter, and I just wanted to tie that to my first visit to your beautiful church. One thing I'd like to touch on is the fact that Fort George Island has changed quite a bit since this church was built, and I see a few of you nodding, so I'm not going to dwell on this. But you're probably aware that when John Rollins and his wife Hannah first began developing this island, articles were written about it, glowing articles were written about it in Scribner's magazine and Harper's. And they described it as a jewel by the sea and described its 4-mile-long beach. And the modern mind might wonder where that beach is. And the answer is that it is no longer. It's no longer here. And that, I'm told by pretty good authorities, is a result of a number of things, among them the jetties that are at the mouth of the St. Johns River. So this is not the island that people knew in the 1800s. I have in my hand a wonderful book that was published by the University Press of Florida. A few of you are nodding already. It is about the works of art, all celebrating Florida, in the Vickers collection, which is easily the greatest collection of artistic works on our state. And on the cover, you have a painting of Fort George Island. In fact, it's titled Fort George Island. It's by Thomas Moran, who was with the well-known Hudson River School, but is better known for his paintings of Yellowstone, which helped form it as a national park, and his paintings of the Grand Canyon. You can see the dunes and the beach stretching away in the distance. That's a little hard for us to square with our knowledge of Fort George Island today, but it gives you an idea of what it looked like. All right, let's talk about Florida Carpenter Gothic churches. And I'm going to go quickly through a summary of the traits that they tend to have in common. And as I do that, you will be able to think about your church and look around and see that this is a quintessential Carpenter Gothic church. Let's go through the defining traits of what a Carpenter Gothic church is. We'll start with a summary. It's a wooden church in the Gothic Revival style. Most of you, all of you probably know that the Gothic Revival originated in England and was carried by a wave of clergymen and architects and immigrants to the United States. And in the United States, that sparked the American Gothic Revival, and you saw beautiful stone churches and cathedrals raised in our major cities. Let's take, for example, New York City. You have Trinity Wall Street, a perfect example, some would say an archetypal example of the American Gothic Revival. You have St. John the Divine, and then as my mind leaps from one reference to another, you even have the National Cathedral in Washington, which was undertaken later, but still in the American Gothic Revival style. Now, were these gigantic works of stone and brick and mortar appropriate for the frontier? They weren't. They weren't necessary for the frontier. They were far too large for settlements that might contain only 150 people, maybe fewer. And stone and brick were hard to come by on the frontier and difficult to work with, time-consuming, required special skills. But what was plentiful on the frontier? Wood, of course, trees. And so you had the birth of the Carpenter Gothic style. This style is found only in America. Now, there are wooden churches in the rest of the world, quite famously the stave churches in Norway, but the Carpenter Gothic style is found only in the United States and part of maritime Canada. That's the only place where it's found. Okay, let's talk about the defining traits. In Florida, these churches are constructed of heart pine, usually longleaf pine, and even the roofs in Florida were made of wood, usually southern red cedar, and I imagine in this location it was probably that, or cypress. Around the time of the Civil War, you could get 1,000 shakes of cypress on the St. Johns River, a little further upstream, not near here, for $6. $6 for 1,000 shakes. So all these churches, including this one, would have been roofed with wood shakes initially. The metal roofs came later. The exterior siding is usually board and batten, not always. That's another one you can check off for this church. These churches are small. They're usually 50 to 70 feet. This one is only 48, if memory serves correctly, 48 feet long. So they're very, very small. To put that in context, an Amtrak train passenger car is 85 feet long. So your church is 48 feet long. A train passenger car is 85 feet long. The seating is about the same too. Here, if we squeeze tight, we might manage 75 people, maybe 80 if we really pushed it. Whereas on the train, you can seat 72. All right, other traits. These churches are tall and slender and pointed. And I'm going to dwell on that for a moment because a synonym at one time for Gothic architecture was pointed architecture or perpendicular architecture. Everything in Christian architecture has a meaning, and it is not a coincidence that everything invites the eye upward in this church, because it's hoped that as the eye is invited, so too will be the mind. So everything points up. And what does a church look like on the horizon? It looks like a hand pointing to heaven, right? Forgive me for that. I'm going to put that in a safer location. All right, other traits. The walls are topped with gables, so you have that here too. The roof is steeply pitched. And turning to the inside for a moment, the ceiling is always open to view. There is not a drop ceiling, but in all these churches, with the exception of one, a later added drop ceiling at St. Agatha's and Defuniak Springs, you always look up to the scissor trusses. And again, scissor trusses are a hallmark of the style. The nave is always long. The chancel is almost always deep. Here, it's fully a third of the overall length of the church, so a very deep chancel. Sometimes the chancel is a budding chancel or expressed with a lower roof line and narrower walls. That's not the case here, but you do sometimes see it. Next, there's often a tower. There is not one here, so that's more in keeping with a chapel-type appearance. The windows are always of the lancet type, L-A-N-C-E-T, meaning that they are long, they are narrow, and they come to a point. And that point will be one of two types. It will be a straight-edged point, as you have here, or it will be a classic curved Gothic arch. You see both in the Florida Carpenter Gothic churches. They're always filled with stained glass, and those come in two basic types too. You have what's called quarry windows, and you have perfect examples of quarry windows here. Quarry, Q-U-A-R-R-Y, comes from the French word carré, meaning square, or it can mean square. And if you look, you see the lozenges in the windows are square, or diamond shaped. They're up on their, standing on their corners. But those lozenges represent the origin of the word quarry. Now, in the center of each lozenge or pane, you have some stenciling. You have a foliate or a geometric design, and that is called grisaille, G-R-I-S-A-I-L-L-E, a French word that denotes that particular type of sketching or imprint. It is always black or gray. Those quarry windows, while very rich, very expressive, and expensive, were less expensive than full memorial windows or figurative windows. And this window here, I better not leave the microphone, this window here with the cross is a classic figurative window. Figurative windows can include biblical figures or legendary figures or saints, and those were typically more expensive. And usually they came, as this one did, after the original construction. The quarry windows would be replaced with figurative windows. Now, in Florida, the churches are elevated off the ground on brick piers, always. And if you see a church, and you will see some of them, that are half brick and half concrete, it's because they have had to start replacing some of the brick, which has begun to disintegrate. You still have your brick piers, as does St. Mary's and Green Cove Springs, and many of them do. But some, such as St. Mark's in Palatka, have pretty much all of their brick piers replaced because they were sinking into the ground and they were disintegrating. All right. In Florida, the churches usually had chimneys. You had one back here, and there was always a wood-burning stove in the church, and the smoke from the stove was piped out into that chimney. Often the stove was placed near the organ, usually a melodeon or a small portable organ of the day, either hand-pumped by an assistant or pumped with bellows by the feet of the organist. And the idea behind that placement of the organ near the stove was to keep the organist's fingers from getting too cold to play. The churches today are often painted in white, as this one is, with the trim in some other color, but that's not the way they were painted originally. They were painted usually in a brown or gray color, and that was thought to tie them to their stone ancestors. It was also thought more subdued and more appropriate to a sylvan or forested background. And in those days, if anything, the trim would be in white. But white paint was more expensive back at that time. Later, when a formula for white paint that was cheaper came onto the market, then you began seeing all of the churches repainted in white. Now, there's some unique features about Florida churches, and one is that a number of the churches, particularly the river churches on the St. Johns River, have battens that are triangular in cross-section. Now, I think all of you know, but I'll say it just in case, that the siding outside is board and batten, and that means that the boards are vertically aligned, but to cover the cracks that are left for expansion, the carpenters nail on strips of wood, which are called battens. Usually battens are rectangular in cross-section, but yours and some of the other churches have battens that are triangular, an isosceles triangle in cross-section. And I talk about that for a good page and a half in the book. And I won't be able to go into all of it now, but it is an absolutely beautiful and highly functional adaptation of the Carpenter Gothic idiom that, as far as I know, is unique to Florida. I always am a little apprehensive when I say that because I expect a hand to go up and somebody to tell me, well, actually there's one in Minnesota that has triangular battens, but that hasn't happened yet. And I think it may be limited to Florida. The second thing that you see in Florida churches, and I'm so glad you have them here, is ventilation panels. If you look at the windows in the nave, you'll see very small hatches under the windows. They don't lead outdoors anymore, but though they originally did, and they would have been fixed on hinges and probably closed with a latch. And those were to be opened to create ventilation in the church before air conditioning. And they are really effective. I visited St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs for the first time on a very warmish day in late April, years and years ago. And the docent who was guiding me was kind enough to open all the ventilation hatches and tilt some of the windows as well. And I believe that's the only Carpenter Gothic church remaining in Florida that has windows that still tilt outward on a central pin and ventilation hatches that open, ventilation panels that open in the originally intended manner. I think it's the only one. So that was a privilege, and immediately the church was filled with cool breezes from the river. Okay. I think I've covered, taken as much time as I can afford to take, covering the style in general, and you can see how this church really fulfills all of the traits that are associated with the style. Let me talk a little bit about your church, and as I conceded to Alan Bliss right before talking, I'm going to get something out of the way. Everybody here knows at least something about this church, and probably more than one thing, that I do not. Okay, so I stand before you, a humble student, and yet I have had the privilege of looking at these churches now for many, many years, and driving around the state. So maybe I bring a little knowledge of what they have in common, and so I'd like to single a few things out, if you'll allow me to do that. One is that you have a metal roof, and there are some parishes in which even the eldest members think that their metal roofs are original, and I'm almost heartbroken to have to tell them that it's probably not the case. You may wonder, by the way, and we'll have Q&A after, are there any Carpenter Gothic churches left in Florida that still have wood roofs? Do they have wood shake roofs? And the answer is that there is at least one, I think probably two. But one is the Chapel of St. Clement at the Church of the Advent in Tallahassee. It has a wood roof that's about to be replaced. And I was asked in the Q&A up there maybe 2 months ago, do you have any recommendation for us in terms of the preservation of the church? And I said, well, I happen to notice that your roof will need replacement. And if you could find your way to doing it again in wood, that would be just wonderful because it's so unique. And I understand, the senior warden told me after the talk that a gentleman approached him right after the talk and said he'd like to take care of that. So good things can come from the pen, right? So metal roof, I mentioned you have a beautiful bell coat and a cross. Let's come down a little bit, and we've talked about the siding. Let's come to one of the windows. And I'm going to invite your attention, I won't expect you to stay turned around, to the hexagonal window. Some would call it a rose window, and I wouldn't object, in the back of the church. It has a very interesting design, and I'll comment for a moment on that design. You can see that in the center, inside the blue area, there is an essentially triangular shape. It's actually a heraldic shield. And at the points of the triangle, of course, is a Trinitarian symbol to begin with, but at the points of the triangle, you have 3 circular seals. And in one, that's all in Latin. One says pater, father, one says filius, son, and one says spiritus, spirit. And there is a band, an outer white band connecting them. And in that band are the Latin words non est, is not. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit is not the Father. And that captures the separate personhood of the members of the Trinity. However, there is a central seal, and that one says Deus, God. And from each of the extremities, there is a band that extends to it. And within that band is the single Latin word est, is. The Father is God. The Son is God. The Spirit is God. What a perfect and simple and beautiful expression of the Trinity, right? So I thought it would be fun to talk about that because it's a little hard to see from here. Well, we've talked about the quarry windows, and we've talked a little bit about this one memorial window. I might dwell on it for a minute. I need to be careful here because the story's a long one. But many of you, all of you probably know that John Rollins bought this island with his partner, Ayer, both from New Hampshire, for $5,500 at a sheriff's auction in, I'm going to say it was 1879. I may have to check myself on that. I think that's right, but don't hold me to it. The chapter is correct. And John Rollins' wife was Hannah Breck Peters Rollins. And they moved into the old Kingsley house. They redubbed it the homestead. And they already had a 9-year-old son, and their daughter, Gertrude, was born 3 years later after they moved to the island. And it would be fair to say that Hannah Rollins, who is memorialized in this window, was the island's first lady. She was married to the developer. She and her husband opened the Fort George Island Hotel, and it was she who began leading Episcopal services, assembling people at the hotel in the parlor to conduct services. It was she who invited Bishop Young to come to the island, and which he did a number of times for visitations. It was she who made the services even more formalized. They grew. Everybody came to them. And it was she who persuaded donors to give land near the hotel for a church. And it was she who got other contributors to donate $1,000 toward the construction of a church. But then hard times fell on the island, and on the Rollinses. The panic of 1873 and the long ensuing depression tended to have an impact on travels to Fort George Island, but what capped it was an outbreak of yellow fever in Jacksonville, and that absolutely dried up all visits to the island. So the hotel had to be shuttered, and John Rollins, who had initially tried his hand at agriculture and failed on the island, really had no source of income. He began having to sell lots, quite a few of them, on the island, whole portions of the island, to his wealthier brother. And so that was where circumstances stood. But then, as the nation came out of the Depression, toward the end of the 1870s, you had the dawning of arguably the greatest period of growth and prosperity, at least for many, not for everyone, in American history, the Gilded Age. And then another woman stepped into the scene. Her name was Ellen Eliza Cairns Ward. She was from the village of Roslyn on the north shore of Long Island, and she was the mother of two of the Stewarts. There were a number of Stewarts who had homes here, 6 homes here, and they were descendants of the very wealthy partner of John Jacob Astor in the American Fur Company. Well, Ellen Ward came to the island frequently to visit her children, probably grandchildren, and she became aware of the fact that a mission had been formed, but no church, and so she offered $1,500 to Bishop Young, who accepted it, for the construction of the church. But she had in mind another location, this one, and so the church was built here. It was built fairly quickly. Now, Hannah Rollins did not know this. It was a period of prolonged absence for her, and the story has it that she was returning, by steamboat of course, to the island and looked up and saw this church. Not her church, not on her property, not with the money that she had raised, but in fact built by another woman. And she was furious, by all accounts, absolutely furious, refused to set foot on the property. And so for many, many years, the rector of this church and any visiting bishop, including Young and Bishop Weed, who succeeded Young, had to conduct a service here and then go, it's no small distance, either walking or by carriage, usually by carriage in those days, on oyster shell roads, to the homestead, and would have to conduct a second Episcopal service in the dining room there. And this went on for a long, long time. In fact, it went on until Ellen Ward died up in New York. And then only did Hannah set foot in this church. And although she cooled in her anger, she was never warm, according to Gertrude, her daughter. She was never warm toward the church and never very much involved in its affairs. But how ironic, I promised to be brief and I wasn't, how ironic that she would now have a permanent place in the church in which she once refused to set foot. So a little fun with that. Let me turn, if I may, briefly to the Galleon Memorial window, the Alleluia window. This is a modern window. It was fabricated by Truett George, a major talent who was president of the Stained Glass Association of America. As you know, it commemorates Cameron Galleon, who died of cancer at the age of 14 in 2002. And there is a small image of him riding he was an avid surfer, and there's a small image of him riding his last wave in that window. So beautiful Alleluia window. That takes us to the altar window. This window is the work of Edward Colgate. Edward Colgate was a well-known designer of windows, very popular within the Episcopal Church. Bishop Young got to know him personally when Bishop Young, prior to becoming bishop, served for 12 years as assistant rector at Trinity Wall Street. And later Bishop Young called on Edward Colgate to install windows at Christ Church in Pensacola, at St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs, Beautiful, beautiful altar window there. I can't recommend it highly enough if you haven't had the experience. And then this absolutely gorgeous depiction of St. George in the very act of thrusting his lance into the dragon. Now, all of you know, I think, that St. George is a historical figure about whom our knowledge is gauzy with legend at this point, but he was probably a martyr in Palestine. But his story has been fused with an ancient tale of a knight who rescues a village, and in some versions a princess, from a dragon that had been bedeviling the village and demanding human sacrifice. So here he is. You can see the dragon with its claw and its jaws upraised between the legs of St. George. Incidentally, St. George is most often depicted on horseback, but here, consistent with the narrowness of the window, he's depicted on foot, which I rather like. Up above his head, from the left going to the center, you can see the red tail of the dragon. St. George has been adopted for a host of historical reasons as the patron saint of England, which makes sense given that this is an Anglican church. It also makes sense that the mission was named St. George, a little double entendre with the name of the island. I will point out a couple things just before closing. I said that nothing in Christian design is arbitrary. Everything has a meaning. You will see that there are gold circular seals at the four corners of the window. The ones at the bottom are just past the tops of the candlesticks. I'll go briefly to point one out. I'm talking about these. Those symbolize the four evangelists. In the top left one, you have an angel, which is the symbol associated with St. Matthew. In the lower right, you have a winged lion, which is the symbol of St. Mark. In the upper right, you have a winged bull, the symbol of St. Luke. And then in the lower left, you have an eagle, the symbol of St. John. Now, these references come from Ezekiel and from Revelation, but there are other elements mixed in. One is of kingship, the idea being that man, depicted as an angel, is the king of the created world, and then going to the winged bull would be the king of the tamed beasts. The lion is the king of the wild beasts, and then finally the eagle is the king of the birds. So I just thought we'd have a little fun with that. With that, I better stop and throw it open for any questions that you might have. Yes, Alan?
Jonathan, I wonder if you can talk about the physical orientation of this church and the others in your survey. It's typical that church designers will orient the axis of the sanctuary on an east-west line, the sunrise in the morning, lights the chancel window typically. This church is oriented almost on a directly due north and south orientation, so the rising sun lights these windows on the side. What's typical in the Carpenter Gothic?
You still see the traditional Eastern orientation. It can be problematic in Florida. St. Luke's in the tiny settlement of Courtney on Merritt Island has the traditional Eastern orientation. What happened, though, is that the sun was so intense, the coastal sun, that parishioners could not look up at their priest during the service. And it got to be a little awkward because some of the parishioners began wearing sunglasses in church. And you know what they did? They didn't move the church. They elevated the altar window. Not a small thing to do, but they raised it by a good 3 feet. And that apparently solved the problem. So I have wondered about that, Alan, and it may be that they were conscious of that problem. The architect of this church was Robert Sands Schuyler, no stranger to building these churches in Florida. He had already built 3 in the Gainesville area. One survives. It was moved to Stark. It is St. Mark's Stark today. Used to be All Saints Enterprise. He, right before this one, 2 years before this one was built, he designed Grace in Orange Park. And I wonder if he didn't understand that because of the coastal location, it might be a little too intense. So that could be the answer, but I don't know. A more complete answer would be this. I think fully a quarter of the churches, maybe even a third, have the traditional orientation. Some did and have been moved for various reasons. In fact, some have been moved several times. So that's the best I can do off the cuff with that. I do go into that at some length in the book. Yes?
Someone told me once, or I heard this, I don't remember where though, that the ceiling sort of is similar to the bottom of a ship, and that it's kind of a symbol of the church as a safe place for the waves of life. Is that true? Or?
That is true. It's often pointed out. Often there are multiple meanings in these things, but that is often pointed out. And the fact that the word nave is a cousin of navigation and navigability and so forth, it also indicates that. Yes, sir.
Jonathan, if you would, for the people that are going to see this video, Hope's question is a good question, but they'll never hear it. So you may want to repeat that back. My question, and I've got 2 of them, can you comment about the 2 pieces of that window? As you can imagine, I've sat here so many times, just stared at it. The chalice, and then I assume some kind of an altar piece or whatever. And then finally, the materials that this church is built out of, do you believe them to be taken from the island? So those are my questions.
Okay, I'm going to go through the questions. A very good suggestion for those who listen to this later. I've been asked about the orientation of the church and whether there might be reasons it was not oriented so that the altar was toward the east. And then the other question related, you had a couple of questions actually, and remind me of what they were, and then I'll...
Well, the fact that the ceiling and the beams resemble like the bottom of a ship.
Yes, that question had to do with the fact that the ceiling resembles the hull of a ship, the way it's left open and exposed. And now your question, and if you don't mind, again, sorry, I got off track.
Yeah, no, the materials the church was built from, were they shipped in or were they taken from the island? It always amazes me that this is built at a time where there was no electricity. Yeah. And it just, I'm a craftsman, and that astounds me. And then the 2 other panes in the main window that have the chalice and what that other piece is.
So the first question is the materials of the church, are they likely to have come from the island? The answer is yes, they are very likely to have come from the island, which of course was heavily forested at the time. And there are 1 or 2 instances when lumber was brought down from Savannah. I can think of only 2. But otherwise, these churches were built of longleaf pine, heart pine, from the center of the tree. And that, of course, was abundant throughout Florida. Now, the heart of the tree was used for a variety of reasons. Much stiffer, much stronger, much more resinous, and therefore likely to harden and be impervious, practically impervious, to termites over time. And it had a much more attractive grain. Sapwood, which is the outer part of the tree, does not have as attractive a grain. It does not have as much resin in it, and it's not as strong. It's also more susceptible to rot because this all predates chemical treatments for the preservation of wood. All right, you asked about the window a little bit. You're right, you have the chalice there and an altar, and those are symbolic. Another thing you'll note, and it's partly covered by the shrouded cross, is a symbol, and it's the Alpha and the Omega from Revelation. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So very, very familiar to you. Otherwise, the one thing I'll point out about the window is usually saints depicted in windows are not identified by name. And in this case, St. George is identified by name, and I like that. It's just a little unique. You usually don't see that. Another thing you don't see in these churches is the exposed beam. This is post and beam construction, and you can see these posts that stand out from the plaster wall. Hardly any of the Carpenter Gothic churches have that in Florida. They'll have plaster walls, or they may have exposed wood walls. I mentioned St. Luke's on Merritt Island. I can mention All Saints in Enterprise on the north shore of Lake Monroe. And there you're just looking, when you're looking at the walls, you're looking at the insides of the outside boards. So very primitive, beautiful, but very primitive. This is a little further up or further along on the spectrum toward the more stylized end of the spectrum. If you wanted the extremes, I would offer All Saints Enterprise as the more rustic type. And then at the other end, the more stylized end, you would have Christ Church Monticello, or I already mentioned St. Mary's Green Cove Springs.
John, do you think this plaster was added later or original?
It's a great question. Was the plaster added later or original? In this case, I think it was probably early, if not original, simply because Robert Sands Schuyler designed this church, and I think a little more attention was probably given to its finishing as a result of that. But these churches were funny. You know, I had to use the dates of the completion of essential construction, because often things would take place later. The furnishings, the windows often would be empty. These windows were empty for a while, and they would typically be covered with canvas or muslin to keep insects and birds out and rain and so forth. And then the windows would be installed. Bishop Young personally ordered the windows and oversaw their installation here.
Yeah. Where would the bell have come from? How would that have gotten here?
The bell is from the McShane Foundry, a famous bell foundry outside of Baltimore, responsible for most of the bells in American churches in that era. It would have been packed up there and then brought down by steamboat to Savannah, from Savannah to Jacksonville and so forth, and then brought here, probably brought the last leg in a cart drawn by mules or possibly by horse. But that's the bell, and I believe it was paid for and installed by the St. Agnes Society, and I'm pretty sure it bears a St. Agnes inscription. Yes.
Is this an original window?
The question is whether the quarry windows are original, and the answer is that they are. They would have been installed within 2 years, I will say. Maybe someone here knows better, but I would say within 2 years of the church's essential construction, which occurred in 1882.
And the value approximately?
It would be so hard to say. I actually don't know. I mean, if these actually went onto the market, I really don't know.
Well, this is my concern, is being on the finance committee and worried about insurance. Do we have enough insurance coverage?
That's a tough question, and probably one that I won't be able to answer for you, but these almost irreplaceable.
Okay.
Yeah. Particularly this one. This is easily the most valuable window in the church. I would argue that the quarry windows are probably as valuable. This has a special story to it, but this was added later. It's a beautiful window, but the quarry windows, the fact that they're original and the fact that Edward Colgate's studio probably had a hand in them, would definitely add to their value. Yes, Elizabeth.
We're calling it a restoration project because there's a lot of rotting wood in the ceiling, and we're concerned the bell needs to be reconditioned bell tower, we're not sure, we're going to do some investigating. And I've always been curious about the color of the ceiling, because in your book, many are not blue.
Right.
Do you have a comment about that?
I do. I'm so glad you asked. The question is about the ceiling, which is painted blue for those who might be listening later and can't see it. The answer is that the ceiling would not have been painted blue initially. Blue is a cerulean color. It is symbolic. It is used in a number of medieval churches, so it is perfectly consistent with the Gothic revival. But these churches, almost without exception, were stained throughout the interior, except for the possibility of plaster walls. So this ceiling would have been stained and would have resembled the scissor trusses. But to the modern eye, that can be a little dark. It can be, the whole idea was to convey the mystery of faith and connote medievalism, or recapture medievalism. So it was what they wanted. It's not always what we want. And so some of the ceilings have been painted white. One in Willaca was painted blue with white stars, which again has medieval antecedents. But yours was painted blue. I have not known any of the Carpenter Gothic churches anywhere to go back. In other words, once the ceiling is painted, they never go back to a stained brown look. You can imagine, I mean, the church would have to be shut down. There would be, it would take quite a bit of time, quite a bit of money. There would be dust everywhere. It would really be a mess. So expensive, time-consuming, and a terrible bother. So nobody has done it. And I'm not sure anybody wants to at this point.
And I'm curious about the green around you said they're typically gray or brown, but why is ours green?
You know, a number of the churches have the hunter green, and it is associated with England. And please, if anybody has an answer, I'd love to hear it. A number of the churches have the green. All Saints Enterprise does. But I don't, as for a solid, certain answer, I don't have one.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, like, the time frame in which the Blue Gothic churches happened, and like when was the earliest one, and what drove the consistency between them? Was it done in a fairly small window with a limited number of architects, or how did that work? I don't know if I was clear with my question.
Very clear, and very good questions, all of which are answered in the book. The questions were, when was the Carpenter Gothic period in Florida and in the United States, and what drove the consistency of these churches? Why do they have traits in common, particularly within the Episcopal Church? It's pretty hard to find an Episcopal church in Florida other than a cathedral that is not one of these churches if it was built between 1855 and 1900. I mean, virtually all of them were at that time. So that's the period. For the United States in general, it would be 1850 to 1900, so the latter half of the 19th century. It was an episode in taste. It was just something that really captivated the minds of Episcopalians and other denominations too, particularly for rural and frontier churches. Now, why is it so strongly identified with the Episcopal Church? The answer is that the earliest, the purest, the most studied, and the most numerous expressions were found and are found in the Episcopal Church. Other denominations used the style, but it was more prevalent and in the Episcopal Church, and is still identified today with the Episcopal Church.
I wonder if there was any idea to be distinct, make it distinctive from other churches, or other kinds of denominations.
Well, it was the thinking the thinking that many people had was that the classical revival churches, which were popular at the time. That style preceded the Carpenter Gothic in America. That they were devoid of mystery. They were associated with the Enlightenment, and they were not only boxy and utilitarian and bright on their interiors, but they were vaguely pagan, because after all, what does the classical revival church resemble? It resembles a Greek or Roman temple, and so those origins are not Christian. Augustus Pugin, the famous architect in England, and commentators of his time felt that the one true architecture, and they called it that, was the one that arose before the Protestant Catholic split of Christianity. You had really a three-way split: Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. And so they looked to the time prior to that split, which is to say the medieval period, and they felt that the architecture that arose then was the most appropriate for Christianity. And they wrote entire books on that subject, explaining in great detail the correctness of that position.
Distinction between neoclassical, like reference to Greek temples and
Exactly. So Bishop Young, who I've mentioned a couple of times and was the second Episcopal Bishop of Florida, was a Gothic revivalist. He was a champion of the Oxford movement within the Episcopal Church. He was an ecclesiologist to the core, and he brought that. Now, he didn't have to enforce it a great deal because the priests who came with him were also swept up in those movements. So he didn't have to rule with an iron fist in imposing this style, but he nevertheless saw to its purity and to its correctness. Again, he personally ordered these windows. He took a hand in St. Margaret's, Hibernia. He finished that beautiful church and supervised the installation of its windows. Axe in hand, he cleared an area over on the coast on the Halifax River for St. Mark's in Cocoa. So he was very involved, even to the point of clearing land. Any other questions? I don't see any. You've been a wonderful audience, and I really appreciate again the chance to come and give this talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.